Welcome to AI for Good, the leading action-oriented, global and inclusive United Nations platform on AI. Organized by ITU, in partnership with 40 UN sister organizations, and co-convened with Switzerland. The goal of AI for Good is to identify practical applications of AI to advance the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and scale those solutions for global impact. In today's session, we're counting on you to use the live video wall feature to ask questions and post comments to help create an engaging discussion. We encourage you to stay until the end to chat, connect, ask questions, and network with our distinguished panelists and world-class AI experts in the neural network. It is now time to kick off the session and welcome our first speaker. The floor is yours.
Hello, friends of AI, of Earth and Sustainability. I would like to welcome everyone to this new talk in this seminar series on AI for Earth and Sustainability Science. You know, the seminar series in the program AI for Good of the ITU is co-convened by myself, Gustav Kamps, by Markus Reichstein, Joachim Denzler, and Maria Piles, and was initiated in the context of the Excellence Network Alice for the development of AI in Europe. First of all, thanks for attending to the meeting, all of you. And today we will hear about a fascinating topic about self-supervised learning and how these techniques can accelerate research, not only in Earth observation, but also in climate science. It is my absolute pleasure to present our speaker today, Anna Youngblood. Anna is currently working as a research fellow in the European Space Agency, ESA, to develop geospatial models for Earth observation and climate research. Her research focuses on self-supervised learning, and we will learn a lot about that in this talk: foundation models, instrument-to-instrument translation to create long-term homogeneous data regimes. Before joining ESA, she earned a PhD in physics from the University of Oxford, researching on a slightly orthogonal topic, renewable energy and photovoltaics. In today's talk, we will see novel approaches for EO data processing based on self-supervised learning to avoid those, costly tasks of labeling, and at the same time exploit all the wealth of information provided by the unlabeled data. She also promises important applications in land monitoring and cloud modeling, and from there, some intriguing kind of jump to reducing climate model uncertainty. I'm really, really looking forward to your talk. Welcome and thank you for coming and being with us today, Anna, and over to you. Really looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much. Let me just share my screen. So hopefully you can see my screen okay. Thank you very much for the introduction. My name is Anna. I'm a research fellow at the European Space Agency, as Gustav has said. And today I want to talk about my research at ESA that focuses on advancing Earth observation and climate research through self-supervised learning. So to set the scene for the work that I'm doing, with climate change, we're of course witnessing land changes and increasingly frequent natural disasters. It's only January and we've already seen devastating news articles about wildfires in LA, for instance. But even outside of natural disasters, deforestation and land changes are changing local environments with a potential global impact. So if we want to understand all of these phenomena and make predictions for the future, we need to monitor the health of our planet. And we can do this using Earth observation. So very broadly speaking, Earth observation is the gathering of information about the physical, chemical, and biological system of planet Earth. And we have access to different types of Earth observation. So some might be in situ, where we have measurement probes directly where we want to measure specific phenomena. So this could be probes, in the soil to measure soil chemistry, but usually we get point source measurements. So if we want to have larger spatial scale sampling, we can go to airborne observations using planes or drones to measure land, ocean, and the atmosphere. But on a global scale, we really need to make use of satellites. And that is, of course, the bread and butter of what the European Space Agency does, and also the focus of my research at ESA. Today, in this presentation, I want to talk about two different application areas. So one focused on land monitoring and vegetation, and a second application focused on clouds and the atmosphere. And so to start with the land and vegetation monitoring component of this presentation, I specifically wanted to introduce two types of satellite-based Earth observation that are really useful in this context. And so the first one is related to multispectral optical imagery, for instance, using satellites like Sentinel-2, which basically have cameras on board and take pictures of the Earth in different spectral channels. So these measurement systems measure reflected and scattered sunlight or the emission of thermal radiation in a passive way. But we also have access to other active measurement systems. Synthetic Aperture Radar is an example of this on board Sentinel-1, where we have instruments that send a pulse of usually centimeter wavelength and look at the backscatter of that pulse. And in the process of doing that, you get information on both the intensity and amplitude of the signal, but also information on the phase. And specifically, the phase is really useful to detect millimeter scale changes on the surface. So that's super useful, of course, for earthquakes and landslide applications. But SAR has a couple of other benefits. So for one, because you're actively generating a pulse, you can take measurements during day and nighttime. And because the pulses penetrate clouds, you're weather independent and you can take measurements under any weather conditions. So that makes SAR particularly suited for a number of different applications, and specifically disaster response type applications. Over the last decade, Earth observation satellites have collected petabytes and petabytes of data. So we're in a hugely data-rich domain, which of course makes it increasingly impossible to look through this data by hand. And this is where advanced computational approaches like machine learning are, of course, really very useful. But one limitation that we're seeing is for the petabytes and petabytes of data that we have, labeled data is much more sparse. Now, what does this mean in the context of Earth observation? So labels could, for instance, be land cover maps, where we have pixel level annotations of what's a city, what's a forest, what's water, etc. And for the petabytes of data that we have, general raw satellite measurements, these higher level data products and associated labels are much more sparse. So that limits sort of the potential of traditional supervised machine learning approaches a little bit. And this is where self-supervised learning comes in. So the premise behind self-supervised learning is that you train your model in two steps. In the first step, you do pre-training using large unlabeled data sets. And in the second step, you fine-tune your model for specific tasks using limited labeled examples. And so this is, of course, very useful for Earth observation. As a little bit of a side note, this is sort of the training strategy that's underlying foundation models. And maybe this is a term that you've come across in recent years. And foundation models are really these general machine learning models that are trained on vast data sets to be useful for diverse tasks. And specifically, the last point in this is really important. So you want to create models that can easily be applied across applications and provide a lot of value across diverse tasks. And of course, a very prominent example and discussed even, this week with new large language models coming out is the application of language and models like GPT. And they're, with some nuance, trained in a very similar way, where in the first step, you pre-train on vast amounts of text to learn general patterns in language. And then in following steps, you fine-tune and refine these models with limited labeled data and often some type of human intervention. And so the goal is that you get these generative models that are useful across diverse tasks. So for instance, writing shopping lists, creating job applications, writing recipes, etc. But the idea is that you can use these models and respond to user prompts and generate new text content. Now, this concept of foundation models is starting to appear in the scientific literature and Earth observation literature a lot. And so sometimes that's related to, making use of language information. But very often these models are actually trained on other scientific measurements. So for instance, imagery. And here the goal is not necessarily to create a generative model that will, generate new types of data, but we actually want to use it to draw scientific insights from the data that we have. And so specifically for Earth observation foundation models, we've seen a huge amount of literature being published in this area, really in the last couple of years. And this is just, a subset of all of the papers that have been published. And it's becoming increasingly difficult to compare all of these models to each other and understand which model is best for which application. And part of this is because there's a lot of choices we have to make when we're training these models. And it starts with the data sources that we're using as an input. So are you using some optical imagery? Is that multispectral, hyperspectral, or RGB? Are you using radar observations or some type of other higher level data products like meteorological data sets, etc.? Then, of course, the spatial resolution and spatial coverage. Do you train your model globally? Do you focus on specific regions or have some sort of sampling schemes? Do you encode time in any way or just use single time step measurements? A lot of these choices we need to make before we even talk about the model architectures that people use and the training strategies that people employ. So there's a lot of diversity in the data that we have access to, the approaches that we can take, and ultimately also the applications that we might want to apply these models to. So we've started to see some literature emerging on creating benchmarking frameworks, and I think there's a lot more research probably going to appear in the next couple of years to help make selecting models a little bit easier. And for some of these questions that I've raised, I'm not necessarily going to provide answers on all of these in my talk today, although I'm very interested to chat to anyone who's working or interested to work on this topic. But I will share some of the insights that we have gained when we trained our own Earth observation foundation models and when we have made specific choices related to some of these questions. So to come back to how these models are actually trained, I mentioned that the first step involves self-supervised pre-training without labels. And so the architecture of these models is often based on these encoder-decoder type models, where the idea is that you have some sort of input, the model encodes it into the embedding or latent space. And this is really, multi-dimensional vectors that capture what the model has learned from the input data. And so we want these embeddings to be as information-rich and as generally usable as possible so that we can create these models that are useful across tasks. And so this is usually done by giving the model a pretext or proxy task. That's not the final task that you want the model to eventually be good at, but something that will help it get to that point. So one very prominent example is spatial masking, where you're asking the model to reconstruct missing pixels. But there's lots of other applications and strategies that you can employ. Maybe you focus on matching embeddings and giving the model different types of Earth observation data from the same or different locations and asking it to identify whether there's shared information content in the different modalities and many other pre-training strategies. We experimented with a few different architectures, and later in the presentation, I'm going to link some of our publications. But for now, I wanted to focus on the results we've obtained with masked autoencoders and using the spatial masking pre-training strategy. And so the results that I'm going to present today primarily use Sentinel-1 amplitude as an input, and we're encoding time in an implicit way by calculating seasonal means and stacking them as input channels to the model. So after we've done this pre-training, you would keep the weights of your encoder, you would throw away your decoder and attach other layers depending on your task, and you can now fine-tune the model in a supervised way using labels. So now you have input-output pairs of your SAR input and, for instance, vegetation maps or biomass maps or land cover maps or whatever else you might be interested in. And so usually here you would train a new decoder per task rather than creating a model that kind of does all of these tasks at once. Before I talk about our results, I briefly wanted to mention that in the context of working on this project, we have created benchmarking data sets that span a number of different SAR data types and associated labels. I've spoken about the SAR amplitude already, but we also have some more complicated, complex data products that make use of the phase information. And for all of these different data types, we have spatially and temporally aligned machine learning ready data tiles, each spanning about 4 by 4 kilometers, that we have for these 6 geographic regions that cover about 15% of Earth's land area. And you will see that there's some areas that are not complete. For instance, the US is incomplete, and that's because not all of the data sets were available everywhere. And we wanted to maximize data overlap between all of the different data products. And so all of this is publicly available on Hugging Face as M3Leo, a multimodal, multi-label Earth observation dataset. The full dataset is 40 terabytes, but we also have a mini set with a subset of our data samples if you just want to have a look at the data and do some quick experimentation and testing. And all of our code and PyTorch data loaders is also publicly available. So let's talk about some of our results. So we first started by pre-training a mass autoencoder with a subset of our spatial regions, and we used Europe, the US, and China as an input because these are quite diverse geographic regions. And we wanted to figure out if we can assess the usefulness of the pre-trained embeddings before we actually invest the resources to fine-tune our models. So let's say down the line you're interested to predict vegetation percentage. So a mean vegetation percentage per tile, a regression task. Is there a way to already get a sense for whether the model has learned something useful for this specific application? And the answer is yes. And one way to do this is to actually visualize what these embeddings look like. So what we did is we took the different SAR data tiles and we encoded them and took these embedding vectors out. And because they're really high dimensional, we had to do some 2D reprojection, and then we get a map out like the one shown here on the right. And so the X and Y axis are not important, but what's important is that each point corresponds to one input data tile, and we care about the relative encodings of all of these tiles with relation to each other. And so then what we can do is we can paint the labels on top of the embeddings to see if the model is already understanding some nuance in the different data tiles. So here you're seeing tiles with low vegetation percentage in this dark blue purple, and tiles with high vegetation percentage in yellow. And so at this point, the model has not yet seen any of these labels, but we already get relatively good clustering, and that it's able to identify which tiles come from high vegetation regions versus low vegetation regions. So this is a bit of a qualitative indicator that the model might have learned something useful. So what if we then actually invest the resources and fine-tune our models, for instance, with the data in Europe? One of the things that I've mentioned earlier was that these models are supposed to be really good when labeled data is sparse, when fine-tuning data is sparse. And so to test this explicitly, we fine-tuned a model multiple times with varying amounts of labeled examples. And so in Europe, we have a total of 120,000 data tiles, each spanning 4 by 4 kilometers. And so we fine-tuned a model with 100% of that data, or 10%, or 1%, or 0.1%. And unsurprisingly, the more data you show to your model, the better it tends to do. That's not necessarily a novel insight. But when we then compared this to a model that was trained from scratch, we saw that across the board, the prediction errors increased a lot. So clearly the pre-training has helped us to extract useful information out of the input data before we get to the fine-tuning step. And interestingly, we only needed less than 5% of labeled examples with pre-training to match the performance of a model that is trained on all of our data in Europe, but without this pre-training step. And now this is, of course, really interesting because it shows us pre-training works. We get useful information out of this pre-training step, and we can confirm that we need fewer labeled examples downstream. This was even better when we fine-tuned in South America, so a region that was not previously seen during the pre-training. And in this particular context, we needed less than 1% of labeled examples to match the performance of a model that is trained on all of our available data in this region. So clearly, there's a lot of information sharing and information transfer from the pre-training. So to give you a bit of a scale of what this actually means, so on the left here, you see a map of Europe where I've highlighted 1% of our data tiles. So that's 1,200 data tiles, and cumulatively, that's about 2/3 the area of Belgium. So it's really not much data at all. But when we fine-tuned a model with just these 1,200 data tiles and then performed inference across Europe, we get these really high quality vegetation maps out that, at least on this spatial scale, look pretty indistinguishable to the ground truth. So really very good performance. Now, foundation models are supposed to do well across different tasks, and I'm primarily focusing on the vegetation application today, but I briefly wanted to mention that we also tried other slightly more complicated tasks, for instance, land cover segmentation, where each color represents a different land cover class. And so here you see SR input on the left, and then the ground truth land cover map in the middle, and our predictions on the right. And you can see that we get pretty good predictions out. We're losing a bit of spatial detail, but overall the model is doing really quite well. And when we're looking at some of the metrics, we again need a fraction of our labeled examples to match the performance of a model that is trained 100% from scratch. So now that we've seen that pre-training is useful and that we need, only small data sets for this fine-tuning step, the next question that kind of comes up is how well these models actually generalize across regions. And so here the idea is that ideally we would have a model that is pre-trained on as much data as we have available and has seen everything, so that we can then apply it in contexts where we only have very small data sets available to us. And so to test this, we pre-trained a model again on all the data that we had in these 6 geographic regions, and then picked 1%, so these 1,200 data tiles in Europe, and tested how well this model is then able to predict vegetation in other places outside of Europe. And so here we're showing the percent errors on the test set. And while the percent error in Europe is relatively low, it's okay in the US. Definitely in South America, China, and the Middle East, we get really high prediction errors. And that's maybe not hugely surprising. These regions have very different vegetation to what the model has seen before in Europe. So why should it be able to do well in these contexts? And we can have a bit of a closer look at these predictions. So on the left, you see the ground truth vegetation map, where red indicates high vegetation percentage and white indicates low vegetation percentage. And then our predictions on the right, which are definitely off, and we have some artifacts that kind of seep in from probably the satellite tracks that the model is not able to handle very well at all. So what if we instead sample data globally rather than sampling in one region alone? Now let's talk about why this is an interesting experiment to run. Very likely, most users of foundation models are not going to have the computational resources to pre-train the models themselves. So you might download weights off of ESA's or NASA's website or other organizations like CLAY that do all of this heavy pre-training for you. And then you're going to want to use this model for your application, potentially in data sparse, in label sparse areas. When you have data available, that's great, but when you have to create these labels yourself, you're going to want to know how to pick those labeled examples to get the best bang for your buck. So let's say you only have resources to label these 1,200 tiles. Should you pick them from one region, or should you try to sample globally to get a model that better performs globally? So this is the experiment that we wanted to run. But now, of course, this means that we're really sampling very little data in each of these regions. And so, for instance, in China, we ended up using only about 300 data tiles that are shown here in this map. So together, this is 0.05% of China. So it's very, very little data that the model sees. But even even then, we were massively able to improve the spatial generalization of our models. So we're losing a little bit of performance in Europe, but that's, understandable. The model has seen fewer examples in this context. But in all other areas, we were able to improve prediction performances quite a bit. And to draw your attention to the performance in China, we were able to reduce our error by almost a factor of 4 just by picking a couple of examples in this area. And when we then have a look at, inference and the prediction maps, we're really getting very high quality predictions out, despite the fact that the model has only seen so few examples in this region. But sometimes you will find yourself in situations where global data is not available. And this is specifically the case when we're using ground stations or other types of measurements that might be oversampled or very widely available in Europe or North America, but not necessarily available everywhere. So the question that we wanted to ask is there a way that we can intelligently select samples in Europe to improve the spatial generalization of the models that we're working with? And so we then looked into sampling schemes, specifically related to land cover or DEM features like altitudes and climate classes. And so here the motivation is that all of these are related and important for the downstream task. Of course, vegetation depends on the climate class that a specific region is in. And land cover maps contain information that is relevant to this context as well. So rather than picking the tiles completely at random, can we pick them in a slightly stratified and intelligent way and get better prediction performances out? And so the answer is yes, it works very well. So specifically land cover and climate class sampling, which intuitively make sense for this vegetation task, help to reduce prediction errors in other regions. So just by sampling these 1,200 tiles in a non-random intelligent sampling way, we were able to reduce prediction errors in other regions. And specifically in the Middle East, we were able to halve our prediction errors by just the way we picked our fine-tuning examples. And so basically what I want you to take away from this is that I'm hoping that this will be, a first step towards creating these recipe books for how people can use foundation models for their applications and to help us identify how we can use our resources to label examples to get the best bang for our buck downstream. So before I move on to the second half of my presentation, I just wanted to briefly pause for some intermediate conclusions. So I've shown you that pre-training reduces the requirement for labels, that we get really good performances even with small fine-tuning data sets, and then we can improve spatial generalization through intelligent sampling. And I'm including some QR codes here for our data set and our publications and some additional project details. But now to move on to the second application related to atmospheric monitoring and clouds. I wanted to start with this graph that I think we've all seen at this point. So that's temperature predictions under different emission scenarios, in this case from the CMIP6 models. And one thing that immediately stands out is the really high uncertainties in the climate projections. And of course, that's a problem, because if we're projecting between 1.5 and 4.5 degrees warming, these scenarios require very different policy interventions. And so ideally, we need to reduce those climate model uncertainties a lot. But a huge part of this uncertainty comes from clouds and how clouds are represented in climate models, and that it's really difficult to model the small scale, the small scale physics and interactions of clouds in these global climate models. And clouds impact the climate in a number of different ways. I mean, very generally speaking, they either reflect sunlight back into space and have a cooling effect, or they can trap heat in the atmosphere and have a warming effect. And their radiative properties hugely depend on the type of clouds and the vertical distribution of clouds in the atmosphere. And as the climate changes, so will clouds, and we're not fully sure yet how these complex feedback mechanisms will play out. So ideally, what we would need is real-time 3D global cloud maps to kind of fill in as this missing piece of the climate puzzle, and that would be really useful for improving climate models down the line. But we don't currently have access to observations of this nature. But we do have access to other types of satellite data. So one very prominent example is ESA's EarthCare mission. This mission was launched last year in May and has a number of different instruments on board, including a radar and a LiDAR, that give us these slices through the atmosphere and allow us to directly probe the vertical distribution of clouds in the atmosphere. But as you can see from the visualization, the spatial sampling is quite narrow, so the swath width is very small. And because of that, it also results in very long revisit times. So for EarthCare, on the order of 25 days before it gets to the same place on Earth again. So this is, super useful data, but we're getting a snapshot at a specific point in time, rather than being able to continuously monitor how clouds evolve in the atmosphere. When we worked on this project, we didn't yet have access to EarthCare data. I believe the level 1 data products are available as of a couple of weeks ago. But NASA had a similar mission that was launched about 20 years ago, I believe, the CloudSat mission, that also has a cloud profiling radar on board. And so also gave us these radar reflectivity slices through the atmosphere. One thing to mention here is that all of these satellites are polar orbiting and they're sun synchronous. So they measure specific local regions always at the same time each day. So you're getting specific snapshots at specific times in the day rather than sort of a random sampling throughout the day. But then, of course, in addition to these active satellites, we also have data from passive satellites, like the imaging systems like Sentinel-2 that I introduced earlier. But in the context of weather and climate, we specifically have access to these geostationary satellites that always look at the same point on Earth and take images every 15 minutes and give us this continuous monitoring. But these satellites only see the top-down view, so they're not directly probing atmospheric profiles, but they allow us to see what clouds look like from the top. And so what we wanted to ask in this project is, when we're aligning these vertical slices with the images in different spectral channels, is it possible to get cloud profiles from the imaging satellites? And can we train a machine learning model to understand this mapping? And then the follow-on question is, can this be extended to 3D? And so, of course, the first step in all of this is to do a lot of data processing and data cleaning to collect paired observations of the images and the profiles and align them in space and time and transform them into 3D to understand their 3D relationship. And so this application, we're not the first to have thought of this, and I wanted to highlight two pieces of work today. So one is actually related to EarthCare, the new satellite, because EarthCare will provide 3D cloud products, and those will be generated using a non-machine learning pattern matching algorithm, where the general idea is that you check the radiances from the top, wherever you have column values, and then you check off track where else you might find similar radiances. And I'm simplifying a little bit, but you're doing some copy pasting to extend the tracks in 3D. But last year, there was also another paper published by Bruning et al., where they used a unit for this task, so sort of first applications of machine learning in this context. And so we wanted to build on this work and kind of extend it further. And this is, a slightly different flavor, but very similar to the setup that I've discussed before, where we have terabytes and terabytes of unpaired images sampling many different times throughout the day, and only gigabytes of actual paired information between these images and profiles. So to give you a bit of a scale of size, MSG collects about 10 terabytes of data each year, but a full year's worth of CloudSat data is only about 150 gigabytes. So if we just want to make use of the image profile pairs, we're really not leveraging our available data to the fullest extent. And as I've mentioned before, we're inevitably constrained to the specific measurement times of the CloudSat satellite. So of course, this setup is then perfect for self-supervised learning. So we also applied a similar approach in our project, where in the first step, we learn from these terabytes of unpaired images using self-supervised learning. And then in the second step, we specialize to predict 3D from these image profile pairs now in a supervised context. And here we again experimented with masked autoencoders and used 11 spectral channels from the Meteosat second generation geostationary satellite as an input. And spatial masking is, of course, not the only pre-training strategy that you can apply in this context, but it's the first that we tried. There's probably a lot of other pre-training strategies that would be very useful for this task. But so here you're seeing some visualizations of what the model is learning throughout training. And so at the beginning, you can see that the reconstructions are really blurry, but as the model is seeing more and more information, it's able to fill in finer and finer spatial details in the images. And to make this point a little bit clearer, so here on the left, you see a mask image, in the middle, a model reconstruction, and on the right, the original. And you can see that it's really able to fill in a lot of spatial detail, despite the fact that it only had access to about 25% of the pixels. And at least I wouldn't be able to infer all of this spatial detail just looking at the very few white and blue pixels that we're seeing on the left. As a little bit of a side note for some of the things we need to think about when we're applying these models that have ultimately been developed for non-scientific purposes in scientific research areas is, of course, related to spatial scale and the features that we're hoping to draw out. So the previous application for Sentinel-1, the data is really high spatial resolution. So you have about 10 meter pixel resolution. So there it doesn't really matter how big the areas are that you're masking out. But for geostationary satellites, in this case, each pixel spans 3 kilometers. So that's already really huge when you want to focus on small scale features in the clouds. So when we're masking out these large pixel areas, the model doesn't have enough information to fill in all of this spatial details. So you get these very blurry reconstructions. And we found that down the line, the model didn't have enough skill to really succeed in our downstream tasks. So we needed to go down to smaller spatial masking to encourage the model to pull out sort of smaller, finer scale details in the imagery. And so you can see here quite well that some of these small scale features you can only really reconstruct if you mask out smaller bits of the image. Now, this is a bit of a trade-off because the smaller your patches are that you're masking, the more information you in total have to encode, and the longer it takes for your model to train. So it's a bit of a trade-off depending on the application that you're looking at. But so after we've done this pre-training, we do exactly the same thing. We keep the weights of the encoder, we throw away our decoder, and instead attach a couple of layers that help us get to this 3D reconstruction task. And so here what we're doing is we're actually tasking the model with reconstructing clouds in 3D from the beginning, but we're only calculating the loss over the slice where we have ground truth information. And so you will immediately see that this is a very poorly constrained problem. And in principle, the model could fill in useless information outside of the slice as long as it gets that correct and the loss is calculated that way. But we found that there's sort of a few arguments for why this approach still works. So for one, our decoder has some convolutional layers. So there's some information sharing between pixels that it can't just fill in nonsensical information outside of these slices. But maybe more importantly, the model never knew where it was going to be tested. So when we generated our training data, we made sure to have training examples where the cloud side overpass can be anywhere in the image. So it never knows where it will be tested and therefore has to learn the underlying relationships and reconstruct the clouds in 3D. We also wanted to see if we can make our models a little bit more geospatially aware, because of course these atmospheric applications, there's a lot of nuance, and we wanted to see if we can encode this in some intelligent way into our model. And so we wanted to encode the date and time of the observations and also the location that a specific example image comes from. And so a naive way to do this is to give the model an extra channel where you just, add your spectral channels and then another channel with the location information. And that's fine, but you're kind of asking the model to implicitly learn this information and to understand that the first 11 channels are related to spectral information, and then you have the location and so on. So we wanted to take a slightly different route. And to give you some technical details on how we implemented this, so in all of our applications, the encoder was a vision transformer. And the way vision transformers work is that they take an image and they tokenize it into non-overlapping patches that are then, encoded in some way, and you pull out features of the different spectral channels. But one thing about vision transformers is that you then usually add what's called a positional encoding vector to this embedding of the tokens themselves. And in the traditional implementation, this just encodes token position. So which of these is token number 1 that's in the top left, and which is token number 2 and token number 3, and how are they spatially related? And that's one of the ways that vision transformers are really, that helps vision transformers be really good at understanding spatial relationships within an image. But recently, there was a paper by Kong et al. Called SatMai, where they also included the date of an Earth observation image in this positional encoding vector. And in their case, one of the applications that they were interested in is to pull out sort of static and transient features. So let's say you have an Earth observation image of an airport. The buildings are static, but the planes come and go and might be seen, may or may not be seen in different overpasses of the satellite. So we wanted to extend this logic and also encode time and coordinates in this positional encoding vector. And here, of course, the motivation is that clouds are, very locationally dependent. The weather we experience in different parts of the world is very different. And because clouds evolve so quickly on the order of minutes and hours, encoding time in addition to seasonality is really important. So as a first step, we wanted to check if self-supervised learning is even useful in this context. So here you see a validation loss as a function of training, and we're comparing a unit to our model trained from scratch in yellow and then a fine-tuned model in blue. And you can see that we have definitely faster convergence and usually achieve lower validation losses, and at the end, higher peak signal-to-noise ratios with pre-training. The unit eventually gets to those places too, but of course it takes a while for it to catch up, given that the model has already been pre-trained and starts from a much better initialized place. But of course, these are kind of, metrics where we're lumping together a lot of information across the whole validation set, so they don't give us a lot of nuance in the performance. So let's have a look at some of that. So here you see on the left, an example image from the top in one of the infrared spectral channels. And in red, you see the overpass of the CloudSat satellite. And then on the right, you see the unit reconstructions of this slice, in the middle, our model, and then at the bottom, the CloudSat profile of the radar reflectivity measurements. And you can immediately see that the unit reconstructions are quite blurry and don't reconstruct a lot of spatial detail. And we're able to improve upon that a bit and specifically make out these 2 convective cores that the unit misses. Of course, you can see a couple of artifacts here and there. There's still room for improvement, but I think this was a really promising result to see. And to show you another example, in this case, where we have multi-layer clouds and specifically these low-lying thin clouds, we were able to reconstruct them better than the unit was. As a little bit of a side note, in a publication, which I'll also link later, we also had a look at different cloud types because they're unevenly represented in our data set. But specifically, we were interested to see if our model could also do cloud type classification at the same time. So here we used a different CloudSat data product. So compared to the radar reflectivity that I've shown you before, CloudSat also has these cloud type data products that are derived from radar and LiDAR observations. So here you can immediately see some differences in the images. For instance, that these high, thin cirrus clouds are not detected by the radar, and that's where the LiDAR comes in. So just as a bit of information about the data. And so when we changed our decoder and basically did cloud type classification, instead of regression to these radar reflectivity values, here are some of our results. And you see that there's definitely some misclassification in certain places, but at least detecting these high level cirrus clouds, our model was able to do much better than a unit. And to look at a little bit more nuance in our model performances, we looked at error maps across our data set for the unit, a normal mask autoencoder, and then our model that encodes time and space. And so this is for the entire field of view of MSG. And you can see that we're able to reduce prediction errors across the board. You see that the lowest errors are actually observed over the ocean. And that's because, the background information is much easier to understand than if you make predictions over land, where you might still get some signals from the land. But in the intertropical convection zone, which usually has a lot of deep convection, we were able to reduce prediction errors and reduce regional biases a little bit. And so we did a lot of ablation studies to check where this improvement was actually coming from. And we compared a normal model with one that just has time encodings and one that just has coordinate encodings and one that has both. And we found that a lot of this weight is being carried by encoding coordinates. So having access to spatial information is really important for the model to learn what types of clouds it can observe in different places. But we also found that time encoding was really useful to reduce sort of seasonal prediction biases a little bit. Now, just to finish off, up until now, I've promised you 3D, but I've shown you 2D clouds. So I wanted to include a couple of visualizations of what our predictions actually look like in 3D. So here you see the image with the corresponding cloud side overpass, and overlaying is now the predictions of our model that look like clouds. So that's the first good takeaway. But so as a visual quality assessment, we can reproject our clouds and see what they look like from the top to see that they match the MSG image really quite well. And of course, because a model was trained on these 15-minute cadence data from MSG, we can also make these time series predictions and get really nice, continuous visualizations of our cloud maps out. And if I'm showing you a top view here now, you can see that it matches the top view image quite well. Now, of course, there's a lot more work that we can do to validate our results, and we're talking to a lot of experts. Ultimately, it would be amazing to be able to incorporate some of this into climate models. So if you're interested to work with us, please feel free to reach out at any point. But just to close off, I've shown you a lot of diverse examples and how self-supervised pre-training is really useful to leverage these large Earth observation data sets, and that it really helps to reduce the requirement for labeled examples, and that with intelligent data sampling, but also this geospatial encoding, we can really get a long way. And specifically, the last point, I think, is something that deserves a lot more attention in the literature, so that we can get to a place where we don't just take models that have been developed for non-scientific applications, but that we can make these models more geospatially aware and more geospatial for the applications we're working on. So there's the QR codes for our publications and data sets at the bottom. But I just briefly wanted to say, of course, none of this work was done in isolation. I had wonderful people that I was working with on these projects. And both components of my presentation were started, and really the bulk of this work was done during the Frontier Development Lab, and specifically the Earth Systems Lab component of it, which is an interdisciplinary research program that is funded by the ESA Phi Lab. So I had wonderful people to work on these projects and just want to give them the credit that they deserve. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks so much for this very informative and enlightening talk. I think I'm pretty sure that there are like some questions and doubts and curiosities probably, and some food for thought. It would be ideal. In the meantime, I don't see any questions so far in the chat, but maybe while people is warming up, maybe I have some questions and curiosities myself. You know that I tend to think like into planes, right? At a very general level and a more practical level, right? So we are doing something for a purpose, and of course these foundation models are fascinating, and because you have shown us some very nice examples. I was very curious about the fact that we are going to deal, and we are already dealing with multimodal and multi-scale processes, right? You showed some very nice examples of, going for medium range, high resolution, Earth observation radar, but we all know that there are other foundation models that are trying to go, at other scales with reanalysis data and also climate models. So all like ingesting everything and crossing fingers very tightly and hope that everything goes well, right? So I don't know. I wanted to ask you about your feeling about this. The more the better, right? The bigger the databases is the best way to go. I don't know. Just
Yeah. Yeah.
a reflection about
Yeah,
it.
yeah, yeah. No, I mean, this is a really interesting point, and I think there's been a lot of work that, as you said, has branched out into different data sets. So, for instance, the NASA Impact team is working on their Prithvi models, and they have models that were trained on, Landsat Sentinel-2 data, but then have also started to create models for weather and climate using meteorological data sets as an input. And I think that's, such important and amazing work. Maybe from like a really high level standpoint of where I would like to see more research and that we're starting to see, but I think is a good area to invest more energy in, is making it clear that the models understand what it means to use different data types. So rather than just throwing lots of data at the model, is there a way for us to actually properly learn what it means for data to be multispectral or hyperspectral from radar sensors? Can we encode that information in some more intelligent way? Because maybe that will then also allow us to apply these models for use cases where the input data is different than what it was pre-trained with before. Because that's, of course, a big limitation at the moment, that you kind of need to try and match the format of the data downstream. But then also to really properly understand what the nuances of the different data sets, different data types are. I think that's really important. And then, of course, understanding how well you can adapt these models. What if you don't have exactly the same type of data? Can you then apply it for different contexts? I think very likely that's the case, because already we're seeing that, for scientific applications, it's useful to have models that are trained on ImageNet. And somehow there's a lot of useful information in that. But specifically, yeah, encoding a lot of this nuance, I think, is going to be very worthwhile.
Yes, I completely agree. We have a question on the chat by Alessandro Grassi. He's, of course, thanking you for the interesting talk. I have a couple of questions. The first one says something like, when using a pre-trained model for fine-tuning, should the decoder be the pre-trained one or a new one should be trained from scratch? That's a technical question. I thought it's useful for the practitioners. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a good question. And of course, there's again a lot of choices that you can make. So from the encoder side, you can either keep the weights exactly as they are during the pre-training step, and you can freeze them and then just train the decoder on its own. And we've done some experiments for this, but across the board, across these two different topics, we always found that fine-tuning also the weights of the encoder was very useful. So often the frozen weights themselves weren't quite as useful as the weights that we can get to eventually. For the decoder, we always trained it from scratch, so we didn't do any pre-training on that side. But of course, there's strategies that you can employ where you can train different layers at a time, and maybe at the beginning keep the encoder weights frozen, and first train the decoder, and then gradually unfreeze everything and fine-tune it. So there's a lot of strategies that again make the task, of course, a lot more complex. And for the second question that I see you're having about the vegetation estimation tasks and what variables we're predicting. So the vegetation data that we were using is a MODIS data product, which basically gives us the percent of tree cover in a specific area. So that's what we were using here. But we also did some experiments with above ground biomass data products that were provided by ESA's Climate Change Initiative, which is actually the team that I sit with at ESA. So yeah, there's a lot of different data sets that are very related to this.
Yes, yes. Well, there's a lot of interest in the chat about sharing the data, sharing the QR code of your presentations and everything. Just a reminder, everything's recorded and will be posted online. So no worries about that. Maybe coming back to the questions of that you have, slightly gone through the presentation. I was very intrigued about the time encoding now, the geospatial encoding, right? I think this is quite critical, not only in the let's say in geospatial foundation models, but also in as you have mentioned in language models, right? And I don't know about the issue can be really dramatic when you're working with non-stationarity, right? Because I mean, when you move to, I don't know, ideally to develop a kind of Aurora foundation model type of things, you will have to deal with non-stationary, of course, non-linear processes, but non-stationary processes as well. And I don't know what is the current state of all this. It looks like a bit of I don't know, black magic or something, right?
Yeah.
So everyone is coming up with a particular encoding. I don't know if there is like a systematic way of doing it or.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure if there is a systematic way of doing this. So as I've discussed in the presentation, we were debating if we should kind of go the simple route of just throwing the data at the model or doing it in this way. And of course, that's also, you hope that the model kind of learns this information, as you're giving it, this additional time encoding, for instance. But the application areas that I was focusing on, for clouds, it's important because the evolution of clouds, depends on time, but I haven't shown any applications for something where this information is super critical. So for instance, disaster response type applications where you're looking at floods or fires and having, access to environment variables, but then also time information is really important. And of course, that's a really difficult problem to crack. And actually, from the first half of this presentation that I've given, there was a follow-on project as part of the Frontier Development Lab last year, where they specifically looked at foundation models for forecasting floods. And of course, then the problem gets a lot more difficult. So I think there's a few applications in this area, but maybe not quite as much work yet. And of course, it makes the problem a lot more difficult because then you need to kind of train the model to understand differences between an image with a flood and without a flood, but in a way that is super reliable and that you can use to create actionable information. So I just wanted to mention this as one piece of work. I'm sure there's many other projects that have started to look at that, but I think that's maybe the next frontier of these Earth observation foundation models for disaster response type applications rather than the problems that I've shown here, which are sort of these annual maps where we just want to use it for scientific insights.
Yes, fully agree. You know that I'm a kind of a big advocate of trying to discover why, why is this methodology working and why is not working and when and how, right? And so the why can be tried to approximate by looking at what are the important drivers and kind of the explainable AI way, right?
Mhm.
But also I'm wondering about the what is not really sure or known, or what is the uncertainty associated to the prediction, right? The epistemic uncertainty of the model, right? So this is something that we are observing all the time with these large language models that can never reply, I don't know. I don't know what are you actually trying to do with these machines, right? Because I mean, it would be really nice to analyze what are the drivers, how these uncertainties propagated through the models, or then just give uncertainty bars. But I don't see any progress into that, right?
I completely agree with this. I mean, the only really explainable component that I've showed is to visualize these embeddings beforehand and get some sort of qualitative understanding. But I think we need to come to a place where we have more quantitative metrics that also allow us to compare models easier and to understand if something will be useful downstream. And I mean, we had enough computing resources from great partners that we were able to run these models multiple times. And especially with the experiments where we had small fine-tuning data sets, we ran them a number of times and get some variances. But I think there's still, a lot more important research that we can do to get better uncertainties out. But that's, a general question in machine learning. Like, do we talk about the same uncertainties when we're talking to physicists or the people designing these sensors as the machine learning experts talk about, and how can we properly assess that? I completely agree. That's a very important area.
Yeah. Another side, I would say, of the same question, or pretty much the same question, is what Hamish Grant is asking in the chat. It's very interesting about so what? I mean, how well these models can actually reproduce or approximate the physical processes, right? Or are they physically consistent in a way? Implicitly, this is what he's asking. Is this feasible to expect from the data that you used, or it's a hard question, I admit.
It's a really difficult question. So because this was a largely data-driven approach, so it's good to see that we can already do this well with a purely data-driven approach. And of course, as you've pointed out correctly, there's a number of ways that we need to validate and sort of assess the performance of these models. Maybe to tackle the question from two sides. So of course, there's other types of machine learning approaches that you can employ where it's easier to encode physical constraints to it. So one idea would be something like neural radiance fields, where you're properly simulating rays through a volume, and there you can add physical constraints a lot easier. Over the course of this project, we were mainly discussing if there's ways, where we can encode some physics into the loss function and, for instance, enforce continuity. If you have one slice, chances are right next to it, the cloud is going to be somewhat continuous, so you can add some of these constraints in. There's many other ways to do that to kind of get precisely to this point of understanding how well they're modeling the physical accuracy of clouds. But in terms of validation, so that's a really tricky question too, because if you don't have the data to validate it, you can't really make a great comparison. So one thing we're working on at the moment is to use ground-based radars, specifically in areas where, and at time points where we don't have satellite data, to specifically come back to this point that I've mentioned a few times, that the satellite only measures at specific times in the day. So can we see if with this pre-training, we're actually getting better prediction performances outside of those time windows? And then you can take ground-based sensors. But of course, then you have the problem that a ground-based sensor is not the same doesn't measure quite the same thing as what a satellite measures, specifically when you're probing from the top and the radar saturates versus you're probing from the bottom and the radar saturates at some point. So then we can make use, of tools that people have developed to make radars look like satellites. And luckily, we've had great conversations with people from the EarthCare team on how they're validating their data. So these are some of the things that we're looking at now for some additional validation. I think, of course, the best validation is to get someone to integrate this into their research and tell us if their results are garbage or if they work. So of course, would be a very useful validation as well.
Yes, definitely. There is like a general question in the chat asking for more details on the presentation, more detail, more contact details. I don't know. I think everything will be set out online. So no worries, guys. Everything is under control, and you can approach Anna afterwards. I have like I don't know, maybe a general question about the similar discussion that we are suffering now with LLMs world, right? In particular because we are developing bigger and bigger models, and with the hope that they will perform better. But there is, of course, this trade-off as well, especially in this seminar series that is called AI for Sustainability, right? So we shouldn't maybe not only compare accuracy, but also take care more about or worry about a bit more about the energy consumption that we are taking on this, and also maybe CO2 emissions associated to the training of these big beasts. I don't know. Do you have some numbers in mind how, because you talk about terabytes of data, right?
Yeah.
But imagine how much energy or how much cost?
Yeah. That's a really important question. So yeah, terabytes of data for just 1 year. So all of the experiments we did were always focused on just 1 year's worth of data. And of course, we have a lot more data available that is going to become, so challenging to ingest using normal compute resources that we as academics might have access to. And I think this is maybe then a broader discussion, for instance, where we're comparing slightly simpler approaches like units to these more complicated approaches. Of course, there's an aspect of unfairness when you're comparing these models, right? Because the unit has 2 million parameters. When you have these vision transformers, you easily have 20 million, if not more, if you want to make a bigger model, right? And then we're training it in 2 steps, and it takes a lot longer to fine tune. So even though we're getting improvements down the line, you have to weigh it up a bit with the resources that are required to train these models. So I think that's a very like a super valuable comment to address in this context. And of course, at the moment, I think what would be useful is, for these compute platforms, maybe when I'm starting an experiment and I see how long it's going to take, I can also get a pop-up that tells me what the equivalent CO2 emissions are, because maybe then I'm going to think about it twice if I want to try a bunch of stuff or if I just want to focus on a few different things. So yeah.
Yes, definitely. And also, I don't know, more maybe these problems that you are tackling are very, very challenging, and they deserve like a lot of compute and data. But other problems that are not so. And there are models, I mean, there are, I don't know, simpler models like regular random forest that can do the job.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Fraction of the cost. Right? So yeah, I don't have any more questions. Let me check in the chat. There is some other questions. Well, all of the questions were related to more details on the presentations, and the details on the contact details and everything. I have like a very generic, very general question. I typically ask the same question everywhere to all the speakers. It has to do with more about the legacy of the research that you're doing. Of course, you're doing something for a purpose, and I think that the relevance of this research is key and clear. And I would like also more to take to hear your voice about the implications in society or economical implications, right? Especially because of these models are really difficult to scrutinize, difficult to understand, and really difficult to make them accountable, right? So for the eventual decisions or predictions. Before we just briefly talk about explainable AI, and I don't know if this is the way that you are interested these days, or you are in another different vein or something. So I mean, it's a general question. I understand. It's more about your thoughts about what is the kind of next steps to make this really
of course.
with the models.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I guess my perspective comes a lot from being at an organization like ESA, where I get to work with people that build these satellites that create this data. So of course, there the motivation is a bit different, because ESA's motivation is for the data sets to be as usable as possible to help bring, actionable insights, and for us to use machine learning in a way that helps us leverage these archival data sets in the best possible way. So the types of conversations I can have here are maybe slightly different than if it was just a standard academic environment where we want to generate knowledge for the sake of knowledge, which I think is very valuable on its own, or the types of conversations you would then have with, I don't know, for instance, the UN, when you then really want to have a chain that gets activated once your model predicts something. And I think that's I'm enjoying that I get to have lots of different conversations with lots of different people, and to see kind of how some of these models then could be integrated into operational chains. And so for the clouds project, for instance, because we've had a lot of conversations with people from the EarthCare team, and they're providing 3D cloud products, they're interested in exploring methods that can then be used. But of course, that's then like a totally different beast, because when you actually want to make these predictions available to the scientific community, you need to be sure that you're getting the uncertainties right, because people will integrate this into their climate models and it will be used to make predictions.
Simple metrics like, I don't know, conservation laws, for example.
Exactly. And of course, propagating uncertainties of the data through is a highly complicated topic. And I have some colleagues that I have conversations with before, and I most certainly am just scratching the surface on this topic. But I think one thing that's really key here is to work on projects where you integrate people from different domains so that you can get a bit closer to that. Because I, as an individual researcher, can't know everything. So I want to work with people that maybe have never touched machine learning before and are the biggest skeptics. They're wonderful to have in your teams because once you've convinced them, you're good, right? And so I think that's, one of the things I enjoy hugely about working at ESA and kind of the perspective that I'm getting now, but also one thing I've really enjoyed about working on these collaborative projects as part of the FDL, because they really put a lot of effort into integrating teams and having people from different domains to try and answer these questions. But I don't have a full answer for you yet, other than that that's coming and it's going to be difficult, but if we work together, I think we can manage.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Very, very nice and a very nice conversation. Great discussion around a very timely and important topic. Thanks so much, Anna, for presenting and answering all the questions. It was really fantastic to have you today, and I think it is now time for closing the session. And thanks again for the talk, and to all of the attendees, thanks again for staying with us. And well, remember that you can follow some conversations, the conversations in the neural network area if you're registered, and that it's, I think, a good opportunity to follow up with some discussions or some questions not answered. So hope to see you all in the next seminar talk on AI for sustainability science. And have a fantastic week. See you.
Thank you for participating in today's AI for Good session. We hope you've learned something new, innovative, and engaging in today's event. We now encourage you to continue the conversation on the live video wall in the neural network. Here you can ask questions, like and comment, share links, complete the poll, connect with interesting profiles, or speak one-on-one using the chat and video function. We invite you to explore the lobby, try the smart matching quiz, visit the virtual exhibits, poster boards, the eShop, and build your personalized AI for Good program. Let's shape the future of AI for Good.